A family burying their grandmother heard moving from inside the coffin. When the funeral director opened it, he froze in terror and called the police. David Morrison almost didn't say anything. He thought he was imagining it. The cemetery was quiet. It's the kind of heavy silence that only exists at gravesides. The kind that presses against your chest and makes every small sound feel amplified. His family stood around Eleanor's coffin, heads bowed, hands folded, eyes wet. The pastor was mid-sentence. The flowers were wilting slightly in the afternoon heat. That's when David heard it. A sound. From inside the coffin, he stiffened, looked around. Nobody else had reacted. He told himself it was grief. He told himself it was the wind, or the trees, or his own heartbeat. Loud in his ears, then he heard it again. David stepped forward and pressed his ear against the polished wood. There it was, soft, deliberate, unmistakable. Something was moving inside his grandmother's coffin. There's something in there, he said. Quietly, the pastor stopped mid-sentence. His mother looked up sharply. His sister reached for his arm, whether to steady him or silence him. He wasn't sure. Funeral director Gerald Hayes materialized at his side with the practiced calm of a man who had managed grief professionally for 30 years. He placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder and offered a measured smile. It's just the wood settling, son. The temperature change from the funeral home to the outdoor air, it causes the joints to contract. Completely normal. Nothing to worry about? David straightened up, looked at the coffin, looked at Hayes, said nothing. The family exchanged the kind of glances that happen at funerals, the ones that say, "Not now. Please, not now," and the ceremony resumed. The pastor found his place again. The workers moved into position. The coffin began its descent. 4 feet down. 5, 6. The sound grew louder. Hayes had been standing at the graveside with his hands folded when he heard it. Not subtle anymore. Not the kind of sound a grieving man imagines. A distinct, rhythmic rustling rising up from 6 feet below. Audible over the wind, over the ambient noise of the cemetery, over everything. He held up one hand. Stop. The workers froze. The family froze. The pastor closed his book. Everyone stared at Hayes. Hayes stared at the grave. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Hayes crouched at the edge and listened. His expression, which had been professionally composed for 3 decades, is shifted into something nobody in the Morrison family had ever seen on a funeral director's face before. Confusion, then concern, then something closer to dread. Bring it back up, he said quietly. They carried the coffin away from the grave, away from the headstones, away from the huddled family to a flat open area in the meadow beyond the cemetery's main path. The afternoon sun was sharp and direct. There was nowhere for shadows to hide. The Morrison family stood in a loose semicircle, 15 feet back, without anyone telling them to keep their distance. They had simply drifted there instinctively. The way people do when something feels wrong in a way they can't articulate. Hayes crouched beside the coffin. He inserted his key into the lock. The mechanism clicked with a sound that seemed much too loud in the silence. He gripped the lid. He lifted it. For 1 full second, he simply looked at what was inside. His body went rigid. His face drained of color so completely that David's mother later said she thought Hayes himself was about to need a coffin. Then Gerald Hayes, 30 years in the funeral business, a man who had seen things that would make most people quit on the first day, stumbled backward onto the grass. His phone was already in his hand. He was dialing before he'd fully caught his balance, coiled beside Eleanor's still form. Occupying the space with an ease that suggested it had been there for some time was a massive black rat snake. Its body was thick and unhurried, arranged in loose coils against the white satin lining surrounding it. Nestled carefully in the folds of fabric, dozens of freshly laid eggs. The Morrison family didn't scream. They went silent in the particular way that people go silent when reality presents something so far outside. They expected that the mind simply stalls. Searching for a framework that doesn't exist, Wildlife experts arrived within the hour alongside the police. Their assessment, delivered with the calm of people who had seen stranger things, was precise. The snake, heavily pregnant, seeking refuge, had found the casket during the days it sat in the funeral home's climate-controlled storage room. Cool, dark, quiet, undisturbed. To her, it was not a coffin. It was a perfect nest. She had slipped inside through a gap in the lining near the base. She had laid her eggs. She had settled in for the long quiet she believed was coming. Rangers relocated her, and the eggs carefully to a nature preserve several miles away. The snake was unharmed. The eggs were intact. In a few weeks, they would hatch in the wild, and none of them would ever know how close they had come to being buried alive beneath an Oklahoma cemetery. The thing that stayed with David afterward wasn't the snake. It wasn't the eggs or Hayes stumbling backward, or his mother's face when she understood what she was looking at. It was the moment before, the moment when he'd heard the sound and almost said nothing, when he'd weighed his instinct against the silence of everyone around him, against the pastor's steady voice, against Hayes's professional reassurance, against the unbearable social gravity of a funeral that needed to proceed, and had nearly let all of that outweigh what his own ears were telling him. He had been one polite, grieving silence away from letting that coffin go into the ground. The snake would have been buried alive. In desperation, in darkness, it would have done what living things do, and Eleanor's rest would have been disturbed in ways no family should ever have to think about. Instead, David spoke up. One sentence. Quiet, uncertain, easily dismissed. It changed everything. Rangers said afterward that the snake's movements had likely been growing stronger as the burial proceeded. The vibrations of the machinery, the change in temperature, the descent into the earth triggering an instinct to escape. Had the ceremony continued uninterrupted, the sounds would have become impossible to ignore. But by then, it would have been too late. Sometimes the most important thing you will ever do is say the uncomfortable thing out loud, in a room full of people who would prefer you didn't. David Morrison almost stayed quiet. He didn't. What would you do in that moment? Be honest.